I think innovation is not primarily a process that has to do with ideas or technologies or tools or methods. I think those things have to be embodied in leaders and teams and communities that are going after something that God is calling them to be effective. Meaningful innovation and mission resides in the apostolic, catalytic imagination of a person or people that want to go do something new in a new context, and they'll do whatever it takes to figure out how to do it.
The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership between 1615 and Missio Nexus, who have a shared passion to mobilize the people of God to be a part of His mission.
Well, welcome to yet another the Mission Matters podcast. I'm here with my friend Matthew Ellison. Today we have Tyler Prieb with us, and it's a pleasure for me to be able to introduce Tyler. Actually, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself in a second, Tyler. But I got to know Tyler a couple of years ago, heard about his vision. It really meshed with a lot of the things that we at Missio Nexus have been saying and talking about regarding innovation in ministry. And whereas we tend to, just by virtue of who we are and what we do, tend to work with established organizations, Tyler's all about startups. And so, Tyler, could you tell us a little bit about your journey first, and then how you landed on founding Missional Labs and what Missional Labs is all about?
Sure, happy to. I'll narrate a little bit here. And thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Ted. I'm Tyler, and I live in Nashville, Tennessee. Moved there this year after a decade in New York City. And I've been interested in missions and ministry and what God is doing around the world my entire life. I remember being 13 or so, maybe 14, and I was on my grandparents' farm in central Kansas. And I remember picking up an unpublished kind of stack of printer paper in their little library in their farmhouse, and it was the self-published memoir of my grandpa's brother, who was a missionary to the Congo and raised 5 kids and planted a bunch of churches and spoke 8 languages. And he was one of those kind of another era kind of missionaries. But I remember
do you still have that transcript?
No, I don't have it. I'm going to track one down. I know who to ask. But I remember I remember thinking as a 13-year-old, I could do this. I could live like this. People can live like this. And the adventure of it shaped my imagination for my life, what the possibilities were in my life. And I really see that. I mean, there's 10 other things along the way I could talk about, but I see that story as something that really shaped my sense of possibility and my sense of call. And I think I realized pretty early on that whatever that Acts 2, that kind of book of Acts dynamic that the early church lived in, that whatever of that was still available to us today, I wanted to be a part of and figure out. And I think it was special that it was somebody that was in my family. There was sort of a sense of permission that came with that. And so, I say that as just a bit of a kind of an origin story thing. There's so many other steps along the way, but I just got in my heart that I wanted to be a part of what God was doing in the world. But I also felt like whatever my great uncle's experience was in the Congo in the 20th century, that type of missionary work wasn't as available to me anymore. It didn't feel like it was as viable for me to go be a white American pioneer missionary in the same sense. I sort of had this instinct that the world had changed a little bit. And so I think I went on this journey of saying, what does mission look like now in the 21st century? And what is my role in it? And what is our role in it? And that led to lots of places and spaces. I got to be a part of the Lausanne gathering in Cape Town in 2010 when I was a graduating college student. And in many ways, I feel like that set the scene for what the evangelical set of conversations were around mission and around what was happening in the world and in the church. I worked for a global missions organization for 6 or 7 years, and it was an interesting group because as I got into working with this organization, so much of the conversation became about innovation and strategy and programs and design and leadership and organizational theory and all these sort of ways of saying, how do we leverage the resources of our missions organization to advance the gospel in meaningful ways in different parts of the world? And I just got kind of absorbed in asking some of these questions around innovation. And what does that actually mean? And how does technology begin to play a role? And what is the cutting edge of all of these things looking like? And so that was another beat in this story, was getting a lot of exposure to global church networks, missions organizations, movements, global church leaders, and facilitating these kind of almost organizational conversations around how do we move? How do we mobilize? How do we collaborate? How do we partner? All of that. I also felt that in some ways I didn't have my feet on the ground in terms of actual mission or ministry. I had signed up to be in ministry, but I was suddenly working in basically organizational dynamics for 7 years or so. So really long story short, I had the opportunity to move to New York City and work with a church planter. And so I worked with a church planter, a guy named John Tyson, and helped plant a church in the middle of New York City full of 20 and 30 somethings that are professionals and from all over the country and all over the world. And it was an opportunity to step away from the macro conversation and just focus on doing a thing, planting a church, pastoring, teaching, preaching, discipling, leading, and figuring out all of my missional theory, how it worked out in reality, so to speak. How do you contextualize the gospel for these types of people? How do you collaborate with other churches in the city? Like all that kind of stuff. Okay, so that was another beat in the story. And in that decade, I just really learned a lot about discipleship, formation, cultures of prayer, listening and waiting on the Holy Spirit, how spiritual awakening and mission relate to each other, how mission works its way out into the workplace, all this kind of stuff. And in the midst of that, also spent quite a bit of time figuring out how do you design and develop networks and leadership spaces to help church planters. So not just doing the work of a local congregation, but also training and developing church planters. Obviously, there's Redeemer City to City, there's Acts 29, there's all these different groups, and just interacting with a lot of those spaces, particularly in secular Western contexts. So the worlds I found myself in were New York, speaking to London, speaking to Seattle, speaking to San Francisco, all trying to say, how do we do mission in this kind of urban, secular, post-Christian kind of space? And so I basically got to begin to blend kind of a normal church planting leadership development playbook with some of the innovation, design, and organizational development tools that I'd learned in my kind of global missions era. And after I stepped away from that church, COVID was a bit of a reset for me. I got married, a bunch of things happened, and I stepped into a new vocational season of saying, how do I put all this together? And so I just sort of said, how do you help ministries and missions organizations and church networks and denominations innovate? And for me, innovation is not a bad word. It's a good word. It speaks to the thoughtful discovery and design and development of new approaches in kind of gospel-centered ways. And how do you do that? And what are the things that keep that from happening? And what are the forces that kind of cultivate that and catalyze that? And what are the environments that are really disproportionate for meaningful innovation and impact in different ways? And how does our spirituality play into that? And how does our theology play into that? And really long story short, I basically was like, okay, if I'm going to help the church innovate for mission, where do I do that? Where do I put my energy? Where do I put my work? And I realized that there is basically two parts of the innovation conversation, if you want to call it that. There's more than that, but this is just a simplified framework. One is existing missions organizations, ministries, and structures that are facing often decline or at least pressure as the world changes, trying to figure out how to steward their legacy and innovate into the future more effectively. That's a big conversation. Every Fortune 500 company in the marketplace is asking a version of that question. And so are ministries, so are missions organizations, so are denominations. So how do you facilitate that process? But the other thing I began to realize is that in innovation theory, if you want to call it that, a lot of times the best disruptive innovations come from the outside, not from the inside. And so I began to ask this question of, what does the startup world look like in the ministry space? what's the startup world look like in the mission space? What's the startup world look like in the church space? And obviously church planting is part of that, but I almost felt like church planting was too limited of a view on all of the ways that we need to be thinking about disciple making, evangelism, apologetics, kind of, spiritual community formation, so on and so forth. And I felt like there was some aspects of what I was looking at maybe in the faith and work space, and there were some aspects of what I was looking at maybe in the church planting space. But I really said, I don't think that there's really an innovation startup pathway or ecosystem for ministries. Not really. And so what would that look like? And so really long story short, I just started putting together a list of all of the projects that I could find out there in the world that were going after some form of Great Commission impact, loosely defined, right? We have all these taxonomies and things, but, and I was able to put together hundreds of them. They were like less than a couple years old. Maybe I found them on Instagram. Maybe I found them through a friend. Maybe it was somebody I already knew about doing a thing or whatever. And I was like, there are a lot of projects out there, people trying to do new stuff, new wineskins, that I don't think really have much of a support pathway. And some of it's maybe technology focused, some of it's maybe media focused, some of it's next generation discipleship, next generation leadership, whatever. But it's all early stage stuff. How do you help it? How do you come alongside it? And so I basically just started putting together programs to kind of run startup accelerator playbooks that were really customized to missional theology, spiritual leadership, early stage organizational design, and trying to expose people to the networks, the mentors, the funders, the institutions, the movements that could really help amplify and accelerate their work. And I guess one of the things, maybe to tie a bow on it, is that I think innovation is not primarily a process that has to do with ideas or technologies or tools or methods. I think those things have to be embodied in leaders and teams and communities that are going after something that God is calling them to be effective. So I don't really nerd out on technology and stuff all that much. I definitely pay attention to it. I think that innovation, basically, meaningful innovation and mission resides in the apostolic catalytic imagination of a person or people that want to go do something new in a new context, and they'll do whatever it takes to figure out how to do it. And so for me, going all the way back to that first story, the missional imagination that I encountered when I was 13, I feel like has been a bit of a through line. Like that's the thing I really want to deposit in people, because I think that's actually the source where a lot of the innovation comes from. So was there that? I mean, long-winded answer.
That's a great narrative. It's actually prompted a number of questions in my mind. I don't know if you got any want to kick off right away, Matthew, but let me start with this one. When you were working in that predominantly church space, so my bias would be that churches aren't very innovative. I mean, you go to almost any church in the U.S., the biggest determinant of how they look and feel is their size. A church of 100 looks like every other church of 100. A church of 1,000 looks like every other church of 1,000. There's not a lot of variance there. What made you feel like your environment was particularly innovative?
In some ways, I don't know if our church was necessarily innovative per se. It's still a church. There's a Sunday service and a kids ministry and a worship team and discipleship groups and maybe some, mercy and compassion ministries and stuff. I mean, it was kind of doing the stuff. The one thing that I think was distinct about it is that it really, really, really focused on a culture of prayer and a culture of revival and spiritual awakening, and that it was populated primarily by ambitious 20-somethings in New York City that were probably disproportionately talented and creative and energetic. And I do think that pioneering a church in a very secular, let's almost call it antagonistic context, creates its own energy dynamics, right? So it was a very high vitality church for sure. And so I think that, if you want to use maybe more organic agricultural language, it was like good soil, rich climate, and a lot of stuff could kind of bubble up, right? But the church itself per se wasn't necessarily innovative. The church was the greenhouse, I would say, for imagination and ideation, and a disproportionate number of I think, new forms of life, and let's call them missional expressions, kind of just came out of it organically.
Yeah, I like to call that a permissive, had a permissive culture toward innovation.
Yeah.
Definitely some organizations I work with are very inviting and welcoming to people that want to be innovative. Others, even though it's not their intention, they're not really permissive toward innovation.
Well, and if I can comment on that quickly, I think that what happens even in the most kind of generative cultures of local churches is that ideas bubble up, leaders bubble up, things develop, things emerge. But I've seen almost no churches that have meaningful pathways for nurturing and developing those ideas very far. So some of the projects that we've served at Missional Labs came out of that congregation that I was previously a pastor at, and are doing amazing discipleship work, but I don't think would have ever been able to find their way through the systems of the church itself to become what it needed to become, right? And so I think in here is also the beginnings of the argument for and the legitimacy of missional parachurch, whatever language you want to call structures that basically need to emerge from the church but then spin out of it. And I think that's a pattern I've begun to see more and more. But it can be a clunky process.
Yeah. So Tyler, you've kind of hit on the why and the what of Missional Labs. I think it would be helpful for our audience to hear an example or two of what it looks like, the projects. How do you work with them?
Yeah. Okay. So in many ways, we're kind of just borrowing we're borrowing elements from a lot of different startup support ecosystems. What do founders and organizations need as they build new things? Blended with kind of the best of missional leadership, missionary training, theology, spirituality, right? Because at the end of the day, I think a lot of great leaders crash on the rocks of bad organizations, but also but good organizations can't make up for bad leaders either. You need both. And so we try to really focus on both of those dynamics in the leaders and the projects we're working with. So we bring them in as a cohort, 10 to 12 projects at a time. Our current program is 9 months. We're going to shorten it, but it's about 9 months. And then we really center the project. So each person is communicating a 4-minute version of their story, of the venture that they're building, or the ministry they're building, or the organization they're starting. And then we basically use that as the focusing frame to do all the coaching. And coaching comes from us. Coaching comes from mentors that I specifically handpick and invite from different networks and different organizations. Ted's going to be a mentor for me in one of my next gatherings. And then we just try to connect them. And then the peer dynamic is usually very, very powerful, right? They're like, well, I'm thinking about this. Well, you're thinking about this. How did you do this? We find that even just getting out of the way and letting them learn from each other is often really powerful. And then we try to just spend a lot of time in prayer, because I think that often the real root issues are fear, courage, shame. Like it's all the deep human stuff that I think actually needs to be unlocked at times for people to build the thing that God is calling them to build. And we do that in a hybrid program format. So there's in-person intensives at the beginning, there's virtual stuff in the middle, there's in-person intensive in the middle, there's virtual stuff after that, and then there's an in-person intensive at the end. It's not, I mean, the cohort design is not that unique, really. We're just trying to give a really rich environment for them.
Well, that's maybe something you could innovate on in the future. But anyway, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
So in this area of startup, you and I have had this conversation before, but the organization Praxis comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
And they do awesome work. And I think you'd agree with that.
Mm-hmm. What's
distinct between what they're doing and what you're doing? Because I think it'd be easy for the audience to think that it's the same kind of thing.
Sure. Well, Praxis is amazing. I think their world, like, I actually worked for them for a short season, and we took Missional Labs through their program. So a lot of what we've learned about startups and accelerators, we've learned from them. In some ways, though, I think if you take it out of the startup framework and just zoom out a little bit, I think there are a lot of different forms of cohort-based leadership formation to try to develop generative leaders that are trying to do stuff. And And I think you can organize them a couple ways. I think you can organize, so a startup accelerator organizes them around a common stage, at least. Usually accelerators are stage based. You're either pre-seed or seed or launch or whatever your stage is. Sometimes it organizes them by business model, so for-profits, nonprofits, subdivisions within that. Sometimes they're organized geographically. Hey, let's get leaders from this city or leaders from this region. Sometimes they're organized topically. So one of the things Praxis has begun doing more and more lately is trying to articulate a taxonomy of impact areas, opportunities for redemptive innovation. And this is everything from foster care to racial justice to ethical work. There's like 30 of them. Okay, that's great. That's fine and really good. I think you have to step back and say, what problem are we trying to solve here? What theory of impact and philosophy of ministry is driving that approach? And then where do we want to focus? And so, whether or not you think that we should be going specifically after unreached people groups in the 1040 window, or we should be reaching secular Western culture in our Western global cities, leads to two very different directions, right? So you kind of have to pick your lane a little bit. And then I also think that, and Ted, maybe this is where you're going with this, I think there's this oscillation in the mission conversation always and forever between the Great Commission and the Great Commandment, between word and deed, between, kind of let's focus on doing the thing that we are specifically called to do, which is proclaiming the gospel and making disciples, versus all of the ways that Christianity trickles into social and cultural renewal in society, right? And I don't ever want to be somebody that's like pulling apart something that God has tried to bring together. But I also do think that that there is a frontier of gospel proclamation and of evangelistic engagement, and that we should be pushing on that frontier. And I think that social and cultural impact in many ways is actually downstream of spiritual renewal and spiritual impact. And so one of the things that I'm just trying to do is really reclaim more of a center for traditional missions, but in an innovative way, as opposed to being yet another social innovation ecosystem that's trying to kind of change the structures of society, so to speak. So that's just the convictions we've kind of doubled down on, right? Like, I want to be in dialogue with, how do we do church planting? How do we do evangelism? How do we do disciple making? How do we do healthy, effective church revitalization? I want to be in that conversation.
Tyler, you hit on prayer several times, and as the source. I think it's E.M. Bounds who said every mighty move of the Spirit of God has had its source in the prayer chamber. And if we look at Antioch in Acts chapter 13, I guess we could say that was innovation, right? The church in Jerusalem was ethnocentric, egocentric. The Great Commission stopped in the Jewish neighborhood. And then out of the prayer chamber at Antioch comes this world missions movement that starts to spread around the world.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that. One of my questions is, as you're helping these, startups innovate, and, whether it's church planning or, mission organization, how do you avoid pragmatism? Sometimes pragmatism is the enemy of ministry. Sometimes doing the right things is the right thing, but sometimes doing the right thing is the wrong thing. So how do you navigate that? Like making sure it's anchored in scripture and in prayer, and not just going to a best practice or something like that.
Yeah. It's a fantastic question. And I wrestle with this a lot because, you can't just borrow startup playbooks wholesale because they're built on so many assumptions about capitalism and money and markets and investment and returns. There's so much there in the for-profit space. And then in the nonprofit space, a lot of times you're then entering into the territory of kind of secular assumptions of justice and progress and equity, like all this other kind of stuff about how we should do impact. So there's a lot of like hazards if you just follow the default pathways. So one of the things that we really try to make a lot of time for is space to hear the Holy Spirit. What is the Holy Spirit calling you to? What do you have conviction about? Like, in so many ways, I feel like assignment comes from identity. Who has God called you to be? Who has he said that you are? And the thing that you're called to do is to flow out of that. And so, you know, in the startup, in the VC world, for example, they're always trying to get earlier and earlier and earlier in being able to identify a winner, right? And one of the ways that I think they've started doing this, at least as I've kind of understood it, is before you ever get to a product or a market or anything like that, they start looking for founder problem fit. Is this the right person to solve this problem? Because of their experience, because of their history, because of their story, because of their expertise, etc. And in some ways, I think that that's actually the right question. And that gets a little bit closer almost to a sense of calling and a sense of purpose. And like, what has God given you that only you can see and that only you can do? Okay, so identifying that is kind of the heartbeat. And then it's a tricky dance, but saying, how do you do that faithfully? How do you do that fruitfully? Even if it leads you to a prophetic position where maybe you never build anything that scales ever, right? Like, but you're at least living in authentic prophetic expression of this thing that God has given you, right? Like, I agree, like the prophetic and the pragmatic do not always dance, right? While at the same time figuring out how to create space around that calling such that other people, team, community, beneficiaries, stakeholders, whatever, can join you in that mission, right? And so, you know, I don't like using the word movements typically. I don't like to say we sit here and catalyze movement. I don't like to use that language. But I do think sociologically that that's the dynamic of what happens, right? Like a person or a people or a group steward a vision or a prophetic calling, and then out of the overflow of that, they begin to generate energy and life. And out of that, movement happens, right? And so I try to be careful. I don't want to say you're building a business or you're building, like, I think that the apostolic gift and the apostolic formation happens upstream of whether or not it becomes a church or a business or a nonprofit or a something else. And I just try to like make conscious some of the underlying cultural assumptions about capital and investment and profit and risk and like all the stuff that can get in the way. Like at the end of the day, the apostolic call is ultimately about suffering and sacrifice, probably. And so you can't do the 4-hour work week winner's playbook here. Like that's not what this is. And so
give us one or two examples of organizations that have started that you've been a part of. You've been at this a couple of years now, right?
Yeah, 2.5, 3 years. Yeah.
Okay. So pick a project or two out of one of those cohorts and tell us what's been founded.
Oh man, there's so many good ones. Okay. I was in Seattle a couple weeks ago. And if I'm in a city and I've got somebody from that, from my world who's been through our program that's in that city, I try to see them, try to say hi. And one of them was this girl, Millie, maybe 30 years old. And she was just kind of a prayer person. And she had this vision of kind of bringing back like modern day Levites, like people that are committed to prayer vocationally. And that's the thing that they do in the world. And, you probably know that Seattle has been a bit of a kind of a nuclear graveyard for churches and ministries for the past decade or so. So she'd been pioneering these prayer rooms, basically. Hey, come pray. Any church in Seattle, come pray with us. We're just trying to put prayer right in the middle of Seattle. So she went through our first cohort and we just helped her like take her vision deeper. What are you doing? What is this? How does it work? What's your vision? Where's this going? What's the story you're telling? What do you need? Connecting the dots with people. And so that was 2 years ago. So I'm in Seattle and she's like, hey, our new space just opened. Come see it. I said, okay. So I go, I don't know Seattle that well. And I'm 2 blocks from the University of Washington. And I'm just going to see what she's done. And I walk in and it's 10,000 square feet, street front. The street front's the best coffee shop I've ever seen in my life. Behind it behind the coffee shop, you go down a hallway, there's a door into the most beautiful prayer space I've ever seen in my life with all the modern sound, lights, just like everything you could do to have a prayer meeting of 50 to 100 people, Above it is co-working space with offices. And I'm like, how did you do this? What happened? What is this? What's going on here? She's like, well, I built a friendship with a commercial real estate developer that I knew in the city who had a huge vision for prayer and a huge vision for Seattle. And he basically made this happen. And we did I think it was like a $10 million project. And then she has like a $1 a year lease. It's functionally free. And she's got street front. It's like one of the best prayer hubs I've seen in ever. And it's right there. And it's called Adoration House, and you can go visit it if you're in Seattle. And she's calling the churches in the greater Seattle area to pray in unity. And I'm like, you're this 30-year-old woman that you didn't go to startup school. Like, you just have like partnered with the Holy Spirit, and look what's happened. It's amazing.
How about a global example?
One of the guys I'm working with right now, I won't share his name, but he is a guy in northern India, and he kind of has a tech, media, marketing background. And if you talk to him, you would think that he had like gone to college on the East Coast or something. He's just very relatable, very easy to talk to, very like no cultural linguistic barrier, anything, nothing. But he'd never been to the States ever, so I don't even know how he got on our radar. I think a friend of a friend had him apply. And so he came to New York 6 months ago to be in our cohort kickoff. And it was his first time in the States. It was remarkable. It was a lot of fun. But he's basically been running digital evangelism funnels and campaigns and strategies and whatever for his part of the world, in ways that partner with Western missions organizations that have resources and have mandates to reach his part of the world. But then he can be both the technological and the cultural broker to package that all up into more intelligent strategies and campaigns. He's firewalled. It's all safe. It's all good. And then he's able to push people into the church movements and the discipleship movements. And he can literally track all the way from click to baptism. Like, he's got it all. And he's just like helping move the needle in India, which is one of the biggest paradoxical mission fields on the planet, because everybody's got technological access, but it's also the most unreached place anywhere. It's really weird. But so, my heart is for more projects like that. I think we got a lot of room to go to get there. But I think we talk about polycentric mission. I want to see us like launching and catalyzing these new projects and initiatives and ventures and whatever all over the place. I don't want to just launch more cool projects into the Western church. I mean, I'm sure there's room for that, but I want to make sure that we're genuinely like putting our innovation efforts towards the frontiers of global mission.
It's good. Tyler, what challenges are these startup founders bringing into this, initial dialogue when they're thinking about launching something? I'm sure you've seen some common patterns.
Yeah, one of them is just an identity, like a vocational identity challenge. Like, what am I? Am I an entrepreneur? Am I a missionary? Am I a creative? Am I a pastor? Like, and so most people find themselves in pre-established vocational lanes because it's just psychologically easier. Like, okay, I'm a pastor. I'm going to go be a church planter. I'm going to go to seminary. I'm going to get ordained or accredited or whatever. And so if you can give people vocational language, like vocational identity, say, you're not crazy. You're not out in left field. You are a missional practitioner. You're a ministry founder. You are a pioneer. If you can give them that vocational language, it radically unlocks something in them. And then you have to help people go from the side hustle to the main thing. That's a big step. Going from I'm sort of doing this thing over here, and everyone's got a ministry, everyone's got a project, everyone's got a thing they're doing, to say, no, like, I think God's really calling you into this. And how do we help you get to the place where you can put 51% or more of your emotional, psychological energy into it? Because that's what it's going to take for it to survive and for it to grow. Right. And I was just with a senior leader last week from YWAM, was trying to help YWAM figure out the future. Amazing guy. And he was just telling me stories of Lauren Cunningham and all the stuff that had to happen for that to all develop over the past 50 years. And I was just like, where do you find people like that anymore? Like, where do you find the people that can dream like that and think like that and take on that level of risk? And I really do think, not to get in too far into this conversation, but I even just think that the way that our economy works and the way that people develop careers and the way that people have to pay for their lives, like, so many obstacles get in the way of people being able to say yes to a dream that God might be calling them to. And I think that I really think we need, if I really think about it, we need to go all the way back and build new pipelines and new pathways. All of the vocational stuff I'm living out now, in many ways, I feel like was deposited in me from age 17 to 22, basically, right? Because those are the moments where I was sort of sorting out, how do I lean into that? I've got all this stuff in my heart. How do I lean into this? And to be honest, I have a lot of friends that had a lot of the same stuff in their heart back in the day too. And, they've got mortgages and wives and kids, and so do I, by the way, but they just have had to default into lower risk vocations. Just, they have to. And so I think there's a really limited window of time when you can really help people figure out if the thing that God's calling them to can be full-time or like full vocation or whatever. And I get that there's bivocational approaches, so we need to be thinking about that too. But I think just people trying to figure out how to structure this calling or this ministry into the actual fabric of their lives is really hard. It's really hard.
Well, for time's sake, we're going to need to close. Tyler, how could people find out more?
Missionallabs.co is our website. And we're running a couple different cohorts in the next 18 months. And we're going to lean into some technology-focused projects. We're going to explore some different geographic focused projects. And just happy to talk to anybody.
Well, love what you're doing. So just for full disclosure, I'm on Tyler's board and totally believe in the vision. And I'm going to be participating in an event in San Francisco coming up in a few weeks. Looking forward to that very much. And I just encourage people to go out there and innovate. We need a lot of new wineskins. I like to say that we need thousands and thousands of new missionary agencies. When people hear that, they're like, oh, we don't need more of that. But if you say to them, we need to infuse the visions of thousands of entrepreneurs in ministry, they get super excited. Well, those things are kind of one and the same. And you're doing a lot of good work to make that happen. So appreciate you and what you're doing.
Thank you.
Tyler, I'm not a board member, and I'm encouraged by what I hear.
Not yet.
So I can't wait to learn more.
Before you go, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership of 1615 and Missio Nexus. Check out 1615.org and missionexus.org for more resources on the mission of God and the matters of the mission. The Mission Matters podcast is hosted by Matthew Ellison, president of 1615, and Ted Esler, president of Missio Nexus.